Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1095 for February 9th, 2025. Coming up in a few minutes.
I consider myself lucky to have been around that and to kind of had a, ringside seat for both the early days of craft brewing and the early days of craft distilling.
Bruce Joseph was a brewer when the late Fritz Maytag decided that he wanted to make rye whiskey at Anchor Brewing in San Francisco 32 years ago. Now he's retiring after 45 years as a master brewer and distiller for Hotaling and Company. We'll chat later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
The second release in Dewar's four-part collector series, Dewar's Double Double 38-Year-Old, is now available. It's a tribute to the Scottish Highlands, and it's like nothing you've had before. More in a minute.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Hours before punitive tariffs were set to take effect Tuesday against Canada and Mexico, President Donald Trump reached temporary deals with both countries. They agreed to step up border security efforts, and Trump delayed the 25% tariffs for 30 days while talks continue with both countries. Industry groups praised the delay since Canada and Mexico were set to retaliate, targeting bourbon and other American whiskeys, with 6 Canadian provinces set to boycott all or most American whiskeys. Congressional Bourbon Caucus co-chair Morgan McGarvey represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District in South Louisville. The Democratic congressman told me this week the tariffs would have had millions of dollars in economic impact on his state's whiskey makers.
We've seen the impact of tariffs before, and we saw it when Donald Trump was president the first time around. He proposed blanket, widespread tariffs without a lot of strategy, and of course, other countries retaliated against the bourbon industry in particular. Now, you see what's happening in Trump 2.0. He proposes wide, broad, non-strategic tariffs on countries, and what's the first thing they do? They retaliate against the bourbon industry. And so I think this manifests itself in several ways. The last time around, we saw hundreds of millions of dollars in losses to the bourbon industry. This time around, we'll see what happens. There's a pause on the tariffs right now. But in Ontario alone, so not all of Canada, in Ontario alone, I talked to a company in Louisville that's going to lose tens of millions of dollars in sales just in Ontario. And many of the companies are in similar boats. And so then what happens? If these companies are eating these costs, then they're not going to expand. They're not going to invest. They're not going to hire. They're not going to have cool new distilleries opening up, new tourist attractions in Kentucky, which hurts our economy, certainly. The other side is they pass it on directly to the consumers, and people are paying more for the bourbon that they enjoy.
You also face the return of the European Union tariffs in less than a month and a half.
Yeah, I don't think that the tariffs proposed on China, Mexico, and Canada were the end point. I think they were the beginning point of this conversation. And again, what I see is these tariffs are so broad and there's no strategy behind them. We know retaliation is coming. It's different than a tariff. Like, let's say that you pass a policy and then you propose a tariff to protect a certain industry, to encourage manufacturing of chips and semiconductors, to encourage manufacturing of U.S. steel or automobiles. There's ways you can play with the dials to get the right sound out of it that you want. But when Donald Trump just says, we're putting 25% tariffs on our allies, we know they're going to respond. And given recent history, we know that they're going to retaliate against the bourbon industry. We know that's going to impact consumers, and we know that's going to impact the economy, and certainly a state like mine in Kentucky.
What happens when the European Union returns to the 50% tariff at the end of March?
So just on the EU tariffs in the 2017 era of Trump 2.1, there are companies in Kentucky lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue because we're thinking bourbon. it's also, we have to think a little bigger than bourbon when we talk about the bourbon industry too. So all American whiskey, you're talking Jack Daniels, you're talking other brands as well. So big loss to these companies. They also are doing tariffs on other things which impact the company's bottom lines, which I think are important too. So look at Mexico, the tariffs on Mexico. A lot of these bourbon companies also own tequila. Tequila, if it's 100% agave-based tequila, has to be made and bottled in Mexico. That's a cost. We're seeing these tariffs come from all over. They're coming at the spirits industry. If the EU, which is a big market for us, puts these retaliatory tariffs on, I think it will both be passed on to consumers, and it will also hurt the companies in terms of, I say the company's bottom lines. This impacts everybody. You got to remember, I'm from Kentucky. This is going to impact the people who grow the corn that goes in bourbon. It's going to impact the coopers who put it in the barrel. It's going to impact the union guys who put the product in the bottle. It's going to impact the truck drivers who deliver it to the distributors in the stores under our three-tier system of distribution. This is going to have an effect that cascades down on everybody that touches this industry. We saw it before, so this is not guesswork. We saw what happened with the tariffs under Trump 1.0 in Europe. It will happen again.
What are your constituent companies telling you about this?
Yeah, to fight back, right? To stand up and stand up and fight back and talk about the impact. Again, talk about the impact on everybody, from the consumer to the farmer, to the person working on the line, to the marketing dollars, to the tourism dollars for our state. These tariffs are just simply taxes. That's all they are. They are taxes, and they are taxes on consumers. They are taxes on people who work in the industry. And so without any strategy, without any other benefit to this country, obviously this is something that has the industry rightfully up in arms.
What can you do, or what are you doing, short of legislative action to stop the tariffs, given that you're in the minority?
Yeah, and one thing is the Kentucky delegation gets along really well. And I think you actually see potentially some strange bedfellows on this particular issue. There is legislation. I know that Senator Rand Paul has introduced a bill to give Congress more say over how these tariffs and trade go into play. I mean, Congress has a big role in the trade practices of the United States and helping out there. So I'm working with my colleagues across the aisle on this issue. We're sending letters, we're working on legislation, we are raising awareness, we're telling the stories. This really is something that, this isn't just about a company's bottom line. This is about America's signature spirit. This is about American bourbon, American whiskey, in Kentucky, where we make 95% of the world's bourbon. This is ground zero for us. If you're the farmer, if you're the family farmer who grows corn, if you're working and truly some good union jobs in bourbon, where we've got people in the rick houses and on the bottling lines and the assembly places that are helping get bourbon to the stores, we're not going to be, if the companies and the consumers are taxed by these tariffs, I don't see them hiring more people. In fact, we saw, and I've got the numbers here, we saw double-digit growth in bourbon every year until the tariffs. And then the tariffs, we took a step back. And in an industry where you're trying to forecast often 4, 6, 10 years out because of how you have to make bourbon, this has a real impact on the bourbon we drink and enjoy and the people we employ for a long time. I say we. I'm not employing anybody, but you get my point.
How worried are you about what the Trump administration is doing, essentially running roughshod over government?
Yeah, I'm very worried. And I look at this and I try to be objective. I mean, look, I'm a Democrat, so that going in. But I care deeply about what government can do to help the public good, to be here for people. And, it's like what Winston Churchill said, American democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one we've ever tried. And I think that American constitutional democracy, the American way of life, the American governing system is something that's worth protecting. And when you see Donald Trump overturn laws that have been passed by Congress, freeze funds that have been spent by Congress. When you see him going into agencies and threatening to shut them down, agencies established by Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress that power. And our Constitution is very clear about the separation of these powers and these three co-equal branches of government. And what I'm asking my Republican colleagues is, imagine that Joe Biden had done the things that Donald Trump is doing right now. Would you have stood for it? I don't think they would have. But guess what? Neither would I. I don't think any president should abuse the power in the way that Donald Trump is doing it. And he's setting up a dangerous precedent, because if you think you like what Donald Trump is doing because you like Donald Trump, just remember, we are not always going to have a Republican president. The last 24 years, we've had 12 years of Democratic presidents, 12 years of Republican presidents. And you are setting a precedent that, in my mind, is dangerous. It undermines the representative democracy that people have now. You know, the people of Louisville vote to send me here to Congress to talk about these issues, to talk about how to direct funding, and they give that power to Congress. So I'm really concerned about it, and I'm concerned that we don't see legislators standing up for legislative independence, not being Democrats and not being Republicans, but standing up for legislative independence and doing what I think is not just right, but is certainly set out in our Constitution.
Thanks to Kentucky Congressman Morgan McGarvey, co-chair of the Congressional Bourbon Caucus, for joining us. In other news, Diageo and Pernod Ricard both withdrew their earnings guidance this week in the wake of declining sales. Diageo CEO Deborah Crew said tariffs could very well have an impact on her company's sales as much as $200 million. Pernod Ricard had been forecasting a return to sales growth, but now says this year's organic sales will be down by the low single digits. Suntory Holdings CEO Takeshi Ninami is preparing for tariffs as well. He told the Financial Times this week that Suntory will be exporting fewer products to Canada, Mexico, and Europe because of tariffs and anti-American consumer sentiment. Loch Lomond Group has secured planning permission for a new distillery on the shores of Loch Lomond. Construction has already begun at the site, which will include a visitors center devoted to Little Mill, Glen Scotia, and Loch Lomond whiskies, and their Ben Lomond gin. A couple of new whiskeys to mention this week. Ardbeg is celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Ardbeg Committee with Eureka, which was created in consultation with committee members after a tasting at the Fay Gilles Ardbeg Day in 2023. It's matured in a combination of PX sherry and ex-bourbon casks and will be available in the U.S. starting February 27th. Heaven Hill has unveiled this year's Heritage Collection whiskey. It's a 19-year-old wheat whiskey distilled in August and September of 2005. It'll go on sale next month with a recommended retail price of $299.99 a bottle. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's check the calendar and see what's happening around the world of whiskey. The debut of the Maritime Spirits Festival is this Thursday in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Brandy Library in New York City hosts a Great Bourbon's Spirit School on Saturday. The Whiskey Wonderland Festival is February 20th through the 22nd in Ottawa, Ontario. The Fraser History Museum in Louisville hosts a Better Together Celebrating Bourbon with Watch Hill Proper on the 20th. And Dramfest 2025 takes place February 28th through March 2nd in Christchurch, New Zealand. Finally, the New York City Whiskey Walk is on March 1st in Manhattan. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old is the second release in a 4-part limited edition collector series honoring Scotland's most legendary whiskey regions. This rare blended malt, a tribute to the Upper Scottish Highlands, is crafted from nearly 4-decade-old Highland and Islay whiskies. It undergoes Jura's unique 4-stage aging process with a final finish in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks from the prestigious Royal Brackla single malt. The finish invites you to explore your own tasting notes, but for me, there's incredible depth, with rich layers of vanilla, toasted cereals, dried figs, plums, dark chocolate, and a subtle hint of Islay smoke, all beautifully balanced. To truly elevate this tasting experience, renowned chef Gabriel Cruther, in collaboration with Jurors, has created an exclusive selection of custom chocolates. Crafted from the world's finest ingredients, each piece is infused with a few precious drops of Jurors Double 38-year-old whiskey, making this a luxurious and unforgettable pairing. Now available, this exquisite pairing of whiskey and chocolate promises to deliver an unforgettable experience. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2024. Jurors is a trademark. Imported by John Dewar & Sons Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Blended Scotch whiskey, 48.8% alcohol by volume.
This week on WhiskyCast In-Depth, we're celebrating the passage of time. 45 years is a long career, but it's been a rewarding career for Hotaling and Company Master Distiller Bruce Joseph. He started out working under the San Francisco craft brewing legend Fritz Maytag when the company was known as Anchor Brewing, and learned to distill when Fritz decided he wanted to make rye whiskey as well. Old Potrero helped redefine rye whiskeys back then, and Bruce has been making it for the last 32 years. We talked the other day on a Zoom call. Tell me about 45 years in the whiskey industry and what it meant to you.
Well, I was more really 45 years in the craft industry because we got licensed to distill in January of 1993. So that's 32 years ago. So those first 13 years were as a brewer and then transitioning. And I think there were a lot of similarities between, that first phase, going to work for Anchor Brewing, and then the start of craft distilling. It was always a great experience working for Fritz Maytag. The forethought and the inspiration that he brought to it, and kind of diving into new things. I consider myself lucky to have been around that and to kind of had a ringside seat for both the early days of craft brewing and the early days of craft distilling.
Tell me what you first thought when Fritz came to you and said, "We're going to build a distillery."
It wasn't a total surprise because he had talked about, every once in a while he would just mention something, and this was probably, mid 80s or so, about, wouldn't it be something to make rye whiskey? And I think he was, he liked historical things and, historical projects, and he liked projects that other people weren't doing. He didn't really want to do things that were already popular. So a rye whiskey distillery kind of fit the bill, as you remember from that time. Not a lot of interest in, I don't know, it didn't seem like a lot of real serious interest in American whiskey in general, and even more specifically in rye whiskey. To have Fritz say that we were going to do something that came from, from kind of left field or something, it didn't surprise us because we had done other things before that. I kind of wish I had kept some kind of diary or something of those early days, because I don't totally remember what my reaction was to it, except that I thought it sounded fascinating. It sounded interesting. And I think Fritz always instilled in us this confidence that we could take on things and we could accomplish them. I think there was kind of that thing within the company that we thought that we could do things and do a pretty good job of it.
I have to ask, since Anchor Steam went away under the new ownership, what are your thoughts on that, since you made Anchor Steam for all those years?
Yeah, of course, all of us, and we had a lot of events kind of leading up to the closing of the brewery, and at Anchor we had a lot of real long-time employees, and we were all devastated by it, and and overjoyed now that we know that it's coming back. We're very happy to see that. It was pretty depressing, and my last couple times at the brewery, just in those weeks as it was closing, and to see the place kind of dark, and it was still full of all the equipment and everything, but just kind of in that state of being shut down. It was very depressing.
And the distillery was located for a long time inside the brewery, right?
Yes. It was in the back of the warehouse. You had to go through packaging, the bottling line, and back through the warehouse that was used for storage. And we had cobbled out an area back there to install the distillery. Of course, when we started distilling, we had one small still, and it got a little more crowded over the years as we added stills and added larger stills and increased fermentation, and we took up some more space in later years, but we were no longer there when the brewery shut down. When Sapporo bought Anchor Brewing, but not Anchor Distilling, in 2017, August of 2017, we had a 3-year lease with them to keep the brewery in that location. At the end of 2020, the last day of the year of 2020, we moved out, or we moved out prior to that, but that was our last day there. So we continued to operate as a separate company in that same building for a few years.
And now you're in your own space.
We've been in our own space. In 2018, we had the opportunity to take over an existing distillery at Pier 50 in San Francisco. It's on the pier, so it's we don't own the land. It belongs to the Port of San Francisco, but we're the tenants. And we took over the lease and bought the equipment and took over that distillery. The company that operated that distillery had a gin brand that we didn't buy, but we continued to produce it for the company that bought the actual brand. So for a couple of years, we were operating 2 locations, and then at the end of 2020, we moved everything to Pier 50.
And that's where it sits today.
Yes, that is.
You were around for the birth of, as you point out, both craft brewing and craft distilling. What can we learn from those early days that might help some folks now, since there's a lot of distilleries closing up and a lot of the breweries have closed up as well?
Well, for the distilling side, I think, at least in my opinion, the time of being able to make it as a craft distiller based on the novelty of being a craft distiller is pretty much gone. I think that if we're putting products out there in the market, they have to compete with everyone, and that we can't expect people to be drawn to our products just because of the size of our distillery. So I think that, and I think you're seeing it in the craft distilling industry, that the age statements are kind of falling in line more with what's acceptable in the industry and acceptable to consumers. And so I that's my I guess my biggest takeaway of where we are right now. We've never operated like a space that's available for direct sales or cocktails or anything like that. And I guess there's still, that avenue that, might be a little different than just the general wholesale part of the business. But anyway, yeah, that's where I think we're at right now with craft spirits.
You pointed out earlier that you guys started making rye back when rye wasn't very popular. Tell me about the growth of rye's popularity and what role you guys played in it.
Well, yeah, when we started, and when Fritz made the decision, finally pulling the plug that we were going to do this, and we went out to local Bay Area stores to buy the existing rye to try everything. I think there were 3 rye whiskeys available. I think you could get Old Overholt was easy to find, and you could find a bottle of Old Overholt on the back bar of most bars, probably covered in dust. And then you could find Jim Beam rye, and I think Wild Turkey rye, and I think that was about it here. Maybe on the East Coast you could find a few more, but not much going on. And certainly, Fritz's vision of what he wanted to do as a rye whiskey was different than those whiskeys. Being 100% rye and all malted rye and pot distilled. To our knowledge, when the first Old Potrero was released in January of '96, it was the only fully pot distilled whiskey in the United States. So I would like to think that, we had some part in the renaissance of rye whiskey. I think there were other people starting to think about it before we came out with something, and that there were some things that were coming up, and it was heading in that direction. But I'd like to think that that what we did contributed to things.
I don't think there's any argument that it did. What do you think the future holds for rye whiskey now and for Old Potrero?
Well, I think Old Potrero really might have suffered somewhat from being the first, with so many, coming after that. Is, I don't know, there's that certain thing out there that, always embracing what's newest, and that we're a brand that's been out there for 30 years now, and it's it was craft, and it was the first to do that. But I think people might have short memories. So I think a lot of what we try to do now is reintroduce it to people, and I think, well, I'm of course I'm biased. I think Old Potrero is a beautiful whiskey, and just full of flavor, and I think it has a future, and I think rye whiskey in general, to me, rye whiskey is the most interesting grain to distill from, that the most flavorful grain. So I think I think the future of rye whiskey should be good. That people, I think more people will appreciate it as time moves on.
Did you ever think about making other types of whiskey?
Yeah, yeah. You know, and in fact, we have a we Hirsch is our company's brand too, and it's always been a sourced whiskey. We've never distilled it ourselves, but we have a Hirsch American single malt coming out that we actually made. So it'll be the first Hirsch product that this was distilled back at Anchor at the Mariposa Street Brewery Distillery, and that's being released any day now, or maybe it already is. I don't know.
The news release hasn't gone out yet. So.
It hasn't. Maybe I'm not supposed to tell you about it. I don't.
Too late now.
It's too late now, huh? Anyway, yeah. So we're excited for that. We feel like that distilling 100% rye was good preparation for doing a 100% malted barley.
How so?
I think we learned a lot of things about. I think a lot about fermentation and about yeast strains, and one of the things that we did with Old Potrero from the early days is, we experimented with distiller's yeast, but we found that brewer's yeast gave us a better flavor, or flavor we liked more. At Anchor, when we were still one company at Anchor Brewing, we had 2 house yeast strains, and for certain one-off beers brought in other yeast for beers, but we had 2, a lager yeast that was for Anchor Steam, and an ale yeast that was kind of a workhorse for Liberty Ale and Christmas Ale and Old Foghorn barley wine. We used that ale yeast for Old Potrero, and we found that it accentuated the malty characteristics more than distiller's yeast, and we didn't get quite the yield. You didn't get the lower final gravities using that yeast, but we thought the trade-off was just a beautiful flavor, and we've continued to use that. And we've used a brewer's yeast for the American single malt that we're doing too. We thought that the combination of the barley strain that we use, the type of barley, and that yeast gave really great results.
What is the secret to making a good rye whiskey?
Well,
it's easy to make a bad one. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, the things that we kind of zeroed excuse me, was, the yeast, I think, was an important factor for us. I feel like really in our early days, Fritz just had this thing of being very, very methodical, and he was really willing to take the time. And we distilled a lot before we ever started putting new spirit in barrels. Fritz really, that was kind of the kind of a guiding light is you really try to pay close attention to every detail in the process. And so I would say, that fermentation and playing with fermentation temperatures, and once we got into distilling, the cut points and Just everything. We tried to be really, meticulous, and we had that advantage in that we had kind of an open-ended time frame for releasing a product. Anchor Brewing was supporting what we were doing, and we could wait until we thought we had gotten it right before we proceeded to the next step. And I think that was a huge advantage to us that, maybe some small distillers, aren't fortunate enough to have that advantage.
What are you going to do in your retirement?
Well, I'd like to stay involved in the spirits world somewhat. I'm already enjoying not having to get up every morning and go to work, spending time with my wife and seeing my children and everything, some plans to travel, that kind of stuff.
What do you want your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered 50 years from now?
I think just as someone that, part of the team at Anchor that helped, assisted Fritz in realizing his vision. I think that was one of the things that when I went to work at Anchor, it was it wasn't really, I hadn't planned anything out in my life. And I knew someone who worked at Anchor, and they needed someone. And I hadn't thought of a career in brewing or distilling or anything else. And when I started working there, within a month or so, what really struck me is here's this small group of people who are like on a mission and who are passionate about what they're doing. And I thought I wanted to be part of that, that it was exciting to be part of that. And I think, that continued to motivate me over the years, just that privilege of working with a great group of people who were passionate and motivated. And, it's a great experience to work in that kind of atmosphere. So I think that's what I would like. Any kind of legacy is that we did these things that were interesting and unique, and and really all of this came from Fritz. I think that would be it.
Bruce Joseph will be honored with a retirement dinner this Wednesday night and will be on hand. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the third annual release of Westland Distillery's Solemn Peated Malt. It's made with Washington State peat and bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a subtle smokiness, along with soft spices, honey, vanilla, and a hint of oak. The taste is smoky and tart with a touch of creosote, lemon pepper spice, cinnamon, honey, and vanilla. The finish is long and smoky with a hint of tartness. I'm scoring the 2025 release of Westland Solemn a 93. Next up, the Heaven Hill Heritage Collection 19-year-old wheat whiskey that I mentioned during the news. It's also bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has touches of oak, honey, clove, vanilla, baking chocolate, and caramel. The taste is rich with clove, cinnamon, and other baking spices, baking chocolate, caramel, and oak tannins. The finish is nice and long with touches of caramel, oak spices, and just a hint of maple. I'm scoring the 2025 Heaven Hill Heritage Collection wheat whiskey a 93. Finally, let's wrap up with the latest Quiet Rebels release from Scotland's Necknean distillery. Each member of the Necknean team gets a chance to create their own single-barrel release, and this one was created by Amy, Necknean's head of sustainability. It takes whiskey matured in STR wine and ex-bourbon casks and blends it with whiskey matured in ex-Morey wine casks from France. It's bottled at 48.5% ABV. The nose is fruity with peaches, pears, vanilla, honey, and lemon zest. The taste is fruity and tart with lemon pepper, a touch of white pepper, peaches, vanilla, and honey. The finish, long and tart with a touch of spice. I'm scoring the Quiet Rebels Amy from Necknean Distillery a 93. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,800 whiskeys from around the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com. Time to open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what people are talking about this week in our community segment. Ian Bruce posted this from Australia after last week's episode on the tariffs that were put on hold this week. So how deep do people think that tariffs will bore into parts of the industry? The episode does mention about glass bottles from Mexico or grain from Canada, so will we also see U.S. tariffs added to ex-bourbon casks being exported? Will it also see counter tariffs on things like peat being shipped to the U.S., and if so, how much an impact will this cause? Well, you won't see export tariffs on bourbon barrels, but the European Union could decide to put tariffs on American wood products, which could include bourbon barrels. The U.S. could decide to tax foreign grain imports, which would affect peated grain shipped over from Scotland, and a lot of corks come from Spain, so that could also be affected by tariffs. Gerald Glavoda added this on the Ontario boycott of American whiskeys, which is also on hold for 30 days. I find it sad to see the wine and spirits industry used in this tariff war. If you look at the high level of taxes imposed by the LCBO, that $1 billion figure includes a significant portion of provincial taxes which will be lost. That said, I believe that it should be up to the consumer to decide, particularly when the Ontario government has benefited significantly from alcohol-related industries. What will happen to the smaller importers who can't sell their products? And Ivo Fanati emailed this comment about Ontario's liquor monopoly. Good morning, Mark. Really enjoy WhiskyCast. Last week you said that the LCBO was one of the largest purchasers of wine and spirits in the world. I am sorry to correct you. The LCBO is the largest producer of wine and spirits in the world, and we in Ontario suffer for it. Selection is secondary to profits. Small suppliers are discouraged and shut out simply with the quantities required by their 669 stores. In addition to these stores, the LCBO also supports almost 450 grocery stores, licensees, and close to 400 LCBO convenience outlets that all have minimal selection. Serious whiskey drinkers somehow get interesting scotch from Kensington Wine Market in Calgary or while traveling overseas. Alberta also has a monopoly just like the LCBO monopoly, but allows independent dealers to make case orders and fosters uniqueness. Alberta also encourages small batch imports. LCBO makes small batch imports and uniqueness extremely difficult. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Evo. I always hesitate to say something is the biggest or the first to do something because someone will always provide me with the receipts to prove me wrong. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers from all over the world, download the free WhiskyCast community app from your app store and join the conversation. You can also find us on social media. Look for us on X, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. I mentioned STR wine casks in my tasting notes for the Necknean Quiet Rebels Amy single malt a few minutes ago. But what are STR wine casks? Well, it's not a type of wine, but a process for wine casks developed by the late Dr. Jim Swan for his consulting clients. Basically, one takes a red wine cask and shaves down the inside to expose fresh wood, then toasts the inside to caramelize the sugars left behind by the wine. After that, the barrel is freshly charred to complete the caramelization process and expose layers of charcoal to add their own impact to the whiskey. You'll find these STR casks all over the world, such as Kavalan in Taiwan, which built its own cooperage several years ago to make its own STR casks. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us, download the free WhiskyCast community app from your app store, or find us on social media. We're on Blue Sky, X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old blended malt has arrived, and it's a true gem for collectors. Secure a bottle, and you'll be adding a rare piece of history to your collection.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2025. And comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.